challenge.
Tend to the ready.
Natasha, are you happy to go first?
I'll give it a go.
Okay.
Yes, we discussed so much stuff in that group, and that it's very, very difficult to make sense of it. But we certainly in 5 minutes, in 5 years, will probably be more appropriate. Some of the questions that came up were like, how do people with the same presentation actually want to communicate different genders, was one of the first things that we talked about. We talked about how gender is quite often something that's done to us from the outside, and that it can depend on your vantage points. We mentioned intelligibility, and then I put a big box around something which came out: presentation versus identity. And how do you control the gender markers? How do you control how other people perceive the gender markers? This kind of led on to the influence of different cultural contexts. It was suggested that we choose the acts of presentation or whatever that cause the least pain. I'm going to have to move on. I take too long with some of this. And sometimes we simply have to choose the actions which are the least painful. The cause of gender dysphoria can be different in different people, and we kind of revisited that with talking about the bodily morphology, but also the social gender, and how that is different, and how quite possibly those can interact in some instances. Quite an interesting issue which came up was the suggestion that trans represents a discourse of hope, whereas cis is the opposite of that, which is an interesting idea, and was explored a little bit, and is possibly something that we could get different opinions about here. And so, for example, people who are assigned the category cis, if you like, also feel dysphoria and express their genders in different ways from the norm. So trans is actually emerging as a category which opens up different possibilities, whereas cis is a closing down of possibilities. Okay. Moving on, the question arose around, should actually trans be located within sexuality rather than gender? An interesting question. Cis people can also question their gender, but without being trans, and gender can also be suffocating for cisgender people. I'm just trying to think of, hang on, that's page 4, right? Yes, the existence of different possibilities. What else? Yeah, there are issues, I think, around boundaries and where we put the boundaries with you know, if we are talking between cis and trans, where does the boundary go? Are there multiple boundaries? And how do we define those boundaries? Who decides who those boundaries are? And we also mentioned the what's come up in Denmark and also now in Argentina, the sort of human rights based approach to gender, which is rather much more about you saying what your gender is. That may be one of the ways forward, rather than the society telling you what your gender is, and how the act of transgendering, if you like, is going to be different in different contexts. And yes, actually, I suppose one way of not really summing it up, but something which I think kind of works for me, was that actually everybody cis people or trans people adapts their body to express themselves in the world. And I think that's probably a good place to stop before I miss too much out or include the wrong things. I don't know if anybody else from my group wanted to add anything, because it was impossible to get everything in.
I think that was a pretty spectacular effort.
So good.
I normally shut up. I don't
Okay.
shut up.
So, apologies to the group if I miss anything out. Please dive in with following things up. We initially started out with the idea of felt gender, as opposed to maybe the idea of a perceived gender. How does society perceive a person's gender? How are these negotiated? How is there an ongoing negotiation? What does that mean in relation to gender? And that brought in that question of a freedom to navigate. Is there a freedom to navigate, and how is that decided? And what is self-determination? What does that mean? We shifted into the idea of Conchita Vased, and the idea that there's a sense of what that means is I'm a girl and I don't give a damn. And that sort of brought into things about language and meaning. Gender as incongruence, gender in relation to language, how is gender, how are meanings around gender that may be taken in one language to mean something, while in another it means something completely different. And so there was something about the idea of language, the linguistic, the conceptual, and the problems around translation and around meanings. We looked at trans and the idea of the asterisks, the boundaries around identities, and how to build instead an ethics that includes everyone. And that seemed to be this idea of an intermediary ethics. And yet there is this need for ongoing negotiation. So how would that be arranged? How would we be able to think about putting that together? So that basically it means asking, it means discussion, it means debate, it means being able to cooperate. And open borders was seen as a way of maybe initially looking at the way space can be negotiated and renegotiated in a very different non-assumptive sort of way, if you like. So there was something about that presentation which allowed maybe some thinking about an intermediary ethics. The idea then, of course, of allowing gender to exist, even though we don't necessarily understand what it was. And that came out of Maker's talk, which was we don't necessarily understand a great deal of what's being said if we're from a different discipline, but maybe that's an experience that we have occasionally around gender. We don't necessarily know what it means or what it is. So how is that decided? What does it mean to lose the exceptionalism around gender and maybe think about ethics again in relation to how we're trying to understand meanings around gender? And then we moved into this idea of the NHS, what's patient-centred care, what does this mean, how should this be developed practically? The idea that you can go on YouTube and find out a great deal more maybe than you would necessarily from what you may understand from NHS roots, and the expectation that gender should be possibly taken as it is. That is there really a definitive meaning? Is transition all that matters? Is there something about fixing? And what does this actually mean, the idea of fixing? Fixing what? What is being fixed? What's being trans enough? What is it that we want? What do people want in relation to transition? And how does this hit onto systems and access to care? And what demands are made so that others fit into that access route. This went again into talking about the Danish system, the Argentinian system, the idea of standards of care, linking into the idea of a good life, and what this would mean in terms of maybe our present systems if things are no longer surgically mediated or psychiatrically mediated. What does gender dysphoria mean in terms of a complexity, and what about an ethics of change that might need to run alongside some of that? Last little bit, sorry. And there's this idea of sleepwalking. It arose because we were talking about how do we know what we are? Who decides that they have that knowledge, and how is that? There was something about Paris Lees having a sort of, there was a sense of having a certain privilege, but it was, I can't remember how we described it actually.
I call it inverted privilege.
The inverted privilege that Paris Lees may have to be able to represent certain numbers of people, and yet there's a certain trope that follows through of having had a very difficult background and being very depressed and blah blah blah, that has to run alongside it. So what does that mean? What does the idea of sleepwalking? Do we know who we are? What do we mean? Different value systems. Is the body intelligible in a normative society? How do we self-determine? That was quite a big one. Bodily integrity as a form of self-determination. How do we implicate the people who have the authority to bring about change, and that they are expected to do no harm, with an idea of an implicated ethics, the idea that there are maybe some responsibilities that maybe they need to think about in terms of doing no harm. What are the services that we need and we wish for to self-determine, if that's at all possible, and yet we don't have the power because we're not necessarily allowed to be the skilled people to bring about the changes that would require an ethical value system to be put into place. So in effect, who determines and who decides? And eventually it became the question of is it necessary to bypass the NHS? How the market is having an impact on people's being able to transition, and that may basically, you know, I was talking about a client who basically wants to be able to access hormones online are being closed down. What does this actually mean? And it brought out quite interesting tensions, I thought, in our group about the tropes that are linked to psychology and psychiatry that are almost normative in that respect, and what happens if we challenge those. So there's something about ending on the from medicalisation into human rights, that we need to look at things in a human rights issue rather than in a medical issue. I hope I captured as much as I possibly could. Well, I think
Got Mark's a summary in Tracy.
it was a bit fluffy.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
I coined the sleepwalking.
Yes, you did, you
idea
did.
Because, but I was thinking about cisgendered people not so aware of being gendered. They're just, you know, I'm normal. You know.
Well, that was one of the things
Well,
that
it's
came
because
out.
they're not
Marked
aware.
and unmarked categories of cis and unmarked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, unless...
Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to attempt a summary. Again, if I miss anything. It's not going to be entirely chronological, but we'll see. I'll start where we started though. So we started with Lucy Meadows' issue in the context of Cat's talk. And we were thinking about how the story, the Lucy Meadows story in the press, was shaped by social context, and this context shifted in the context of her death, and it's also shaped by the context of the Leveson inquiry. So not just Lucy Meadows' story in and of itself, but how we perceive it at different times and how it might be perceived in research. And we thought the almost forced empathy from the media over her death was shaped in a sense by context. We talked a little bit about the nature of reporting based on press releases and journalists working from old reports, and how this is a social process, in a sense, that might happen regardless of individual intent. You know, a lot of journalists just might not care, but it's a process that might be negative in a sense that's happening anyway. However, intent can shape the process if we want to change it. So perhaps this could be an ethical duty. We thought about, it's important to note when you do the research, is this a snapshot? What's the Lucy Meadows sort of media affair going to look like in several years' time? What's the historical context of it? So we were thinking what the contemporary stories that are depicted as trans-positive look like. How are they shaped by the aftermath of Lucy Meadows' death? And how are stories differently limited due to negotiation over time? So, you know, the reporting of Lucy Meadows was limited in a sense. How might stories be differently limited now? What might change? We're thinking about how critiques of this kind of thing should address context. On one hand, you can have a snapshot experience of something, and Kat's research was almost looking at a snapshot versus change over time, and how might your critiques change to reflect this? And also the fact that individual people are going to have individual experiences, and this matters regardless of the wider social context, the individual experience. So how do you address social processes without losing sight of individual specificity? And I think that's something that was also present in Mirka's talk. So we also talked about the power of being understood, and we talked about that in a medical context, but we started off with haircuts. And I want to quote DK, because I thought this was quite a powerful quote, who said that his experience with open barbers was the first positive experience of a haircut since I was a kid. And the idea of, you know, having problems negotiating that kind of hairdressing experience, the problem of being understood, and the problems with services that have a lack of understanding, leading to a pervasive experience of negativity, which is almost kind of reflecting what Kat was saying about reading transphobic comments in the media, this pervasive negativity that adds up. And someone later on referred back to the Aristotle's medical treatment akin to flogging, which was something people had experienced perhaps in therapy, or had seen other people or even clients experiencing in therapy, as well as within a trans context specifically. And we were thinking about how this is more common when you fail to fit into the expected absolute category. So a medical example would be transition without hormones. And there's a lack of knowledge and imagination, perhaps, a lack of exploring possibilities that leads to this problem, because people aren't considering the possibilities of those who fall outside the categories. And this might be beneficial. For example, there's some evidence to suggest now that chest surgeries heal better if the person who's had it hasn't got testosterone, which means it might make sense in some instances to offer chest surgery when people haven't taken hormones, for trans men or non-binary people who want to have their chests removed. This typically isn't something offered because the pathway is focused on providing hormones first, so someone fits into the male social category and has a beard. You know, by experimenting and and the NHS thinking, okay, maybe we could try this out, it's actually possibly improving results as well. So by exploring possibilities, you actually create something better and something potentially even more financially viable. And we'll get back to that in a minute. Ironically, the private sector's kind of doing this already, but it's not necessarily considered relevant, which is quite sad. We thought about other examples of being imaginative. Open barbers was one. Swimming pools that might allow t-shirts. And we're thinking perhaps the procedural nature of the medical process can prevent creativity. So, for instance, many genderqueer people might not even bother to approach doctors because there's an understanding that perhaps it's not going to go well. So we're thinking perhaps there's an ethical reason to explore or provide possibilities in order for, so if you provide it for one, you can provide more possibilities for everybody else. We thought about how perceptive individuals are to the experiences of others. A lot of the problems we've talked about are related to a refusal or an inability to recognise the agency or being of another, or even the other, if you do that kind of thing. And if you can kind of relate in some sense, or if you can even understand that there's a possibility, there's more of a point of reference. But creating those points of references is easier for people with the energy or the luxury to fight. So we thought about a contradiction in the financial situation in this country, but also perhaps large areas of the world, where the philosophy of treatment in many contexts, including the trans context, is improving, but finances, or the money available, is getting worse, it's decreasing. And trans healthcare in the UK seems to be simultaneously getting better as gender clinics are more open-minded and other NHS providers think about ways they can be inclusive, and getting worse as waiting lists increase, people have access issues due to financial problems. So we were thinking about how do we allow the possibilities that we want to imagine, how do we allow it to happen? So I mean, partly you could have some things such as the chest surgery thing we were talking about earlier, that could create a financial solution. And perhaps, you know, if you provide better housing, better benefits than are currently available under austerity, there are less financial problems associated with mental health. So this could be more efficient, saving money. But on the other hand, we don't want finances to be the only reason to do things. Otherwise you might go, well, your problem, there's an amazing solution we've got for you, but it's too expensive. So there's got to be a balance there. So we thought quite a lot about solutions, and that's where I'm going to wrap up. We thought about creativity on the basis of an agent-led informed consent. And I thought about the first seminar we had where Gabrielle and Sarah was talking about informed consent as a potential basis for treatment. And we talked there about this idea of money again, and what if desired options don't meet financial priorities. And also the delays that can come in, you know, if you're allowing informed consent to change protocols, which could be one way of putting things together, there can be delays that come from consulting ethics committees, preparing formal research. So this could be a problem. We were thinking about how the current focus on rights, in contradiction to this group maybe, we think this focuses on legal obligation in a way that can be unhelpful. It's based on where the law is at a moment of time, and people can say, well, we've fulfilled our legal obligation, we're done, which I see the University of Warwick does a lot of the time, for instance. We were thinking like maybe a way to build upon, or an alternative to the rights discourse, could be creating a space for a multiplicity of understandings, a focus rather than rights on agency and cooperation. We also thought about, based on this, the idea of entering spaces. So we've got lots of people from different disciplines here, but often people tend to talk to their own discipline. So speaking as a sociologist, rather than just talking to a sociologist, if I'm researching health, maybe I should go to more medical conferences. Finally, we talked about how some things don't have to be gendered. You know, unisex hairdressers often offer different options for men or women, but why does this have to be the case? Why do you have to prove yourself male or female? So a lot of our problems could be solved by moving away from these assumptions. And I realised I took longer than everybody else. It's because I wasn't timekeeping myself. Thank you very much. Did I